France is going to the polls tomorrow with the current President Sarkozy finding himself in a battle to stay in power. He's facing a strong challenge from Socialist candidate Francois Hollande. Let's talk to London-based freelance journalist Nabila Ramdani, who's a native of Paris and specialises in French politics as well as the Arab world. Nabila, good to see you. Thanks for coming in. It's a funny old thing because this is being pitched as a crucial time to have an election, especially in a country like France, and it is. And yet there's an inevitability about this first round. And now we have this day of calm where everyone sits and thinks about it before voting tomorrow, or as you say, some are voting already today. Yes,
absolutely. And you're quite right to highlight the inevitability because since the campaign started, 400 polls have been carried out to, survey how the French are going to vote. And every single one of them suggested that Francois Hollande is going to win in the second round. And in fact, the latest poll, which was published on Friday, suggests that Hollande will score 29% in the first round and Sarkozy 25%. So it is inevitable that the two leaders, as it were, will end up in the runoff.
And what we've seen, I suppose, in the last month is President Sarkozy particularly, and Monsieur Hollande as well, kind of grabbing ideas from the further wing of their political direction. So Sarkozy's been pinching ideas from the far right to try and hoover up some of those votes, and Francois Hollande pinching a few ideas from the left. That process may intensify after the first round as they start to go head-to-head.
Very much so. President Sarkozy has consistently, in fact, throughout his career, lurched to the far right and wooed far right voters, especially bringing to the fore themes like immigration, security, and he's self-styled, top cop, and he indeed tried to show that he was the man in charge, especially after the Toulouse shootings. Francois Hollande is a moderate socialist, and he faces competition now from the hard-left Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who's a crowd-pleasing, anti-capitalist, and who's doing pretty well in the polls, scoring 40% in the first round. So there will be attempts by the two candidates in between the two rounds to, again, try to attract those voters and make sure they end up voting for them.
So if the polls are right and we end up with Monsieur Hollande as president in a few weeks' time, here in England we know of him as being a fairly quiet, undramatic kind of man, almost pragmatic. Hasn't done anything particularly distinguished to date in the political sphere. So what kind of France are we looking at that we might have to deal with if Monsieur Hollande becomes president?
I think we'll be looking at a France which will put the emphasis on spending. Hollande has made it clear that he's not the candidate of the rich. In fact, he wants to tax the rich up to 75% for earnings over 1 million euros. He also said he will spend a lot of money on education, on teaching jobs in the police, more civil servants effectively. So that's the kind of policies we are expecting from Francois Hollande. And I think...
Sorry, but attempts to reflate the economy as well. I mean, more money being pumped into the economy than has been so far by President Sarkozy, perhaps?
Oh, he's the exact opposite. Sarkozy, he went for an austerity plan, and Francois Hollande will do the exact opposite. He'll put the emphasis on spending on everything. But I think in terms of climate in France, we'll be looking at perhaps a more appeased France. President Sarkozy, has to be said, has put in place quite divisive policies, especially, with policies, firm measures like the burqa ban, controversy on halal meat and the constant stigmatizations of ethnic minorities.
I mean, Sarkozy's been quite a capricious character over the last 7 years, hasn't he? So I suppose that might calm things down a bit if he were replaced by someone a bit quieter. Mario Monti in Italy, he likes the idea of treating the economy the way Francois Hollande wants to. Angela Merkel seems to be thinking perhaps maybe we should spend a little bit more on Keynesian policies, on refloating our economies. David Cameron, we're not so sure about, but it might be a more peaceful era. I mean, it's possible, or it might just be a very amiable, well-meaning muddle.
Yes, I think it won't necessarily be a bad thing to have, a socialist government in Europe when we have, politically, when we have, the rise of far-right parties across Europe, increasingly so, and also more liberal economies. And as we know, it can have an impact on the social atmosphere in a country. I think it won't be too difficult for Francois Hollande to reach out to David Cameron. It might be trickier to have to deal with Angela Merkel, who openly supported and indeed campaigned for President Sarkozy.
And how do we explain that given these two characters, Hollande and Sarkozy, are so different, they certainly fly different flags, that the French public seem, even now, sort of undecided, kind of drifting into this election thinking, not quite sure which way this should go.
I think I would qualify that. I think what the French are absolutely adamant about is that Sarkozy undeniably had an image problem. He was, he came in as the president of the people, but he ended up being the president of the rich. He has routinely been viewed as, money obsessed, a bit vulgar, to be honest. And this hasn't gone down too well with the French people. And at the end of the day, a recent poll suggests that the top concerns for the French are issues like unemployment, living costs, tax. And as far as these issues are concerned, President Sarkozy's record is far from impressive.
But the basis of the French economy is very socialist, isn't it? The working laws are terribly strict. It's very difficult to hire and fire staff. Things are very laid down. It would take quite a strong character to rearrange. That whole French economy does need, many must say, totally rearranging. Is a man like Francois Hollande tough enough to follow his principles and start really changing things, or will he just drift into the realities of what modern France is?
I don't think Francois Hollande is actually trying to, revolutionize France. He's quite happy with the French model, as it were, which stands out in Europe. And where President Sarkozy, in fact, failed is that when he came to power, he portrayed himself as, a French Margaret Thatcher who was going to reform the economy of France profoundly and indeed, confront the unions very firmly. And he failed to do so. And that's where the French are, unhappy about, because he sort of gave the impression that he was a tough president, but he wasn't really that
Briefly,
firm.
do you think he might try that? If he got a second term, do you think he'd have another go at that?
I think it's very unlikely.
OK, Nabila, thanks very much indeed. Nabila Ramdani, thanks very much indeed for joining us this afternoon. Now, it's a problem associated mainly with the developing world, but because of the economic situation, an increasing number of people in the UK are finding it difficult now to afford to feed themselves and their families. Rising poverty levels mean food banks, which provide emergency supplies, are now opening at a rate of 1 every 4 days. Sky's Fraser Maud reports.
For Kenny and Leanne Jones, spiralling debts caused by rising utility bills and high rents have led them here. The goods they'll take home from this food bank in North Liverpool to their 4 children will mean for a few days at least there'll be food on the table.
Develop like a survival instinct, don't you? And you just go with whatever immediately, is needed.
But if there's anything in the cupboard, I always say around Sal, I say, give it to the kids.
We won't eat.
We won't eat. I just say, give it to the kids. They come first.
The food store here in Club Moor was set up with the help of the Trussell Trust in November and supplies 6 drop-in centres. Food poverty is often thought of as a problem for the developing world, not the developed. But most of the volunteers here have stories of clients whose circumstances have left them in dire need.